Okay, welcome back. We've just finished the video on Jesus turning water into wine in the first 11 verses of chapter 2 of John. Now we're going to complete the chapter, verses 12 through 25, where Jesus clears the temple of money changers. All from the Gospels all four Gospels record the account of Jesus clearing the temple, but only John mentions cattle and sheep and doves and the whip. There's a whip going to be mentioned in here, and the command to depart, meaning get out. Jesus calls the area the temple courts, so they're not actually in the temple proper, but they're in the courts. Because of some of the differences from the Gospel of John, some think that these may have been two separate cleansings. There's apparently, because of the difference in the way they're described, but the temple would not surprise me, because I doubt if they would quit. It would not surprise me that this didn't happen at another time, to be recorded another time, because I doubt very seriously the fact that just because Jesus ran them out once, that they wouldn't come right back and try it again at another time. So that's the situation. I'm just don't care if it was one or two occurrences. It could very easily be two. Okay, the reason Jesus did this and where he was in the temple area all are both important, which we'll cover as we come to it through this episode in the event in the life of Jesus. Okay, let's go to chapter 2, verse 12. We'll start there. It says, after the wedding feast is what that's referring to. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. All right. So Jesus and his mother, no reference to his father being there, but his mother was there, and they have just come from the wedding in Cana, as I mentioned, performing the miraculous sign of turning water into wine, and showing the sign of who he is, the Messiah, when he met a crisis of running out of wine at the wedding. As you recall, the symbolism involved was that Jesus used purification vessels, stone jars, to hold the wine. The symbol would be that he is the new wine, replacing the legalism of Judaism. He is not advocating doing away with the law. We need to get this straight, okay? We know that after the resurrection of Jesus, they're going to understand that the law is no longer needed for salvation, because Jesus becomes our righteousness, or we become is our righteousness. Okay, his death on the cross will pay the price for our sin if we accept it on faith. There won't be anything wrong with still living under, practicing the law. There's nothing ungodly about it. Actually, probably a pretty good way to live. But for purposes of salvation, it will be of no effect. Okay. So he's not advocating at this point, he's not advocating doing away with the law. He says that a day is coming when they will no longer need it for salvation. It's pretty clear. It's almost Passover, one of the two feasts that the Jews are expected to return to Jerusalem. So Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and so here he is in Jerusalem. All right. It's time for Passover. Let's read verse 13. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. All right, I think I just covered all that. Verse 14 says, in the temple, In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. Okay, here's what he finds. He sells people selling animals to be used in the sacrifices. You know, that's part of the law. That's the way they get their sins absolved every year, was following the requirements of the law, and that meant sacrificing animals. And they had these different animals that people, if they didn't have their own that they could bring, they could buy these from these men that were sitting at these tables. And depending on how much money you had would determine what kind of animal you would buy. The doves would be there for people that could not afford, say, a sheep or a cow of some sort. Okay, and they were exchanging money because the temple required temple coins to be. It's like exchanging your money for tokens. I hate to put it that way. When you're going to the fair, you take your money and you go buy coupons, and the coupons is the only way you can use to go through the fair and buy food, or to ride rides, or to buy various merchandise that's out there. Okay, this was the same thing. The temple would not use money, the two-sided money with, Caesar's likeness on one side. They would have temple change. There's nothing to indicate that there was anything crooked going on. They got some kind of piece of the action there for doing the work, but nevertheless, that's why they were there. They were not inside the temple. They were in the temple courts surrounding the sanctuary, particularly the massive court of the Gentiles. It's called the court of the Gentiles. Lots of people. Means lots of business for Jerusalem, and in particular, the temple coffers. When huge sporting events come to Dallas, Dallas promotes them, trying to get them to come here because of what gets pumped into the economy. They come from all around, all parts of the country would come here, and they'll spend money here, and it pumps money into the economy. Same was true then. The Jews were expected to come to Jerusalem at Passover, and while they're there, they spend their money. All right. And this was part of it. But this was not done for that reason. This was done to satisfy the requirements of the law, the Jewish law, the law, what we'll call the law of Moses. The Sanhedrin and the high priest, Caiaphas, even had disputes at one time as to whether or not it was permissible or appropriate to sell animals in the courts of the temple. Apparently Caiaphas won because they kept doing it. Okay, there was a tax for all Jewish men over the age of 20 to pay, which Jesus apparently had no objection to, since he paid it for himself. I'm not sure that he thought it was all that great of a thing, but nevertheless it was paid. You can read about that in Matthew 17 verses 24 to 27 about the gold coin in the mouth of the fish. It's kind of interesting. When you get time, you can go read that. But the money changers were present to satisfy a legal requirement that all donations made to a temple be made in special coinage. It had nothing to do with pagan images on coins, but was designed to ensure the quality and the purity of the money coming in. Okay, so the money changers were allowed to keep a specified amount, for doing the work, and the conversion rate was specified, so there was no evidence of corruption. So I'm just trying to set the scene here, because Jesus is ready to come on the scene here, and some things are going to happen. To me, this is important for the purpose of Jesus' attack on the money changers. It was not dishonesty or moral reasoning. It was not anything to do with morals or dishonesty. It was the fact that it happened at all. That was what was upsetting Jesus. Okay. I don't know if you could make a case I did have a thought. I did not try to make a case for this, but the comment I just made was it wasn't dishonesty or moral questions involved in them doing this. It was that it was doing it at all. I'm not sure that what I'm saying there is exactly right. You might be able to make a case that where they're doing it, if you did it out on the parking lot, it might be okay. But they're in the temple complex when they're doing this, and Jesus was upset. Okay. It was kind of required for them to do this because the temple and the law required them to do certain things. So, okay, let's look at verse 15. Verse 15 says, "So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables." He was upset. It's quite a sight. Jesus is not, he did not lose his temper. This was more of a situation of righteous indignation. You remember he said, "You're turning my Father's house, it should be a house of prayer, and you're doing something different." Okay, the whip was hastily made since no weapons were allowed in the temple areas, probably made out of whatever he found lying around. Okay, he basically ran them all out, vendors and animals and everybody. Finally, we should know he did not interrupt worship. Worship was not going in the temple. He was not making a loud ruckus out there disturbing that. Okay, one other thing I find interesting is in verse 16. So let's go to verse 16. Verse 16 says, "To those who sold doves, he said, 'Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market.'" Okay, that's what I was just mentioning. It's not just the doves. He's talking to those who sold the doves. Okay, but the same goes for the other animals too, I'm sure. Get out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. Other places it says house of prayer. Okay, into a market. Okay, the whole temple area, temple and courts were sanctified areas, but Gentiles were only allowed in the outer areas and the court of the Gentiles. Jesus thought this area, even though it was the only area where Gentiles were allowed, was holy enough to not allow such practices. So he basically said, get out. Okay, the Gentiles could come into the court of the Gentiles, okay, but it's still part of the temple complex. That makes it holy. And Jesus said, you can't be doing this here. Okay, Jesus is attacking the whole financial machinery of the festival system. This would definitely put Jesus at odds with the high priest Caiaphas. He's taking away a source of income, and that's always a problem. You take my money, now you're making it personal. Okay, so they didn't like Jesus. And it brings us to verse 17. Verse 17 says, his disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. They were remembering Psalm 69, verse 9. We won't go back and read it, but that's basically what it says. Jesus is acting out his relationship with his Father. He is driven to defend and promote God's interest. That's why he's there. We are God's interest, his people. The people of the mankind is God's interest. He is interested in mankind. He created them. He doesn't like it when he sees sin, and Jesus is there to do something about it. Okay, he sees the human ruin of God's house, so he is overwhelmed to act. He's incensed, and he expresses his righteous indignation with a whip. Okay, where money is concerned, sometimes the rules about what is okay get bent sometimes, as here, even to the point of ignoring what is appropriate. We can make a little cash. Let's just set up right here. Everybody's got to come through here. Let's set up right here. Sometimes Christians are driven to evangelism. Sometimes Christians are driven to pray for some people. Sometimes Christians are driven to study and promote God's word. Jesus is many more times than that compelled to maintain God's house. All right, let's look at verse 18. The Jews, all right, let me remind you of something, and every time I see this, I'm probably going to remind you until we finish the book of John. When you see the words, the Jews, it does not mean, now, unless context says otherwise, but when you see the Jews, it will mean the Jewish religious leaders. It will mean the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, that group. It'll mean the high priest, all of those people that have religious responsibilities and are setting all the rules for everybody. When it says the Jews, that's who it's talking about. It's not talking about all the Jews on the street. Okay. The Jews, the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" They want a sign. You need to show us that you've got the authority to come in here and wreck our stuff. We've been doing it this way for years, and you're coming in here trying to change it. The Jews, all right, I told you about them being the religious leadership in Judaism. They're asking about performing a miraculous sign. The Jews always want a sign. We're going to see that going through the Gospel of John. They want a sign, as referred to at the Cana wedding, to a sign of the Messiah. They want a sign that can demonstrate his authority to do the things he's doing, to cause all this upheaval and to make all these demands about getting out and all that sort of thing. No one objects. I've got this written real small. No one objects simply about what he did was inappropriate. Instead, they want to know the basis on which he has done what he did. Likely, they know the things showing likely they know the temple services have been compromised. All right. So in their hearts, they know they shouldn't be doing these things, in other words, but they want to know, how come it's you that needs to be the one telling us? All right. Jesus says, look at verse 9. Jesus says, in response to that, and I said, see verse 19. In my note it says, Jesus says, see verse 19. All right. Verse 9, I'm just making a joke now, but verse 19 says this. Jesus answered them, destroy the, all right, here's the sign. They said, show us a sign that you've got the authority to do this. Jesus answered them in verse 19, destroy the temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Very interesting. We know this refers to him at the crucifixion and the resurrection. But they see literally what he says. He's talking about destroy my body, kill me, crucify me, bury me, and in 3 days I will rebuild it. I will be resurrected. But they're not seeing that. Nobody knows about Jesus going to be, at this point, nobody knows that he's going to be crucified and that he's going to be resurrected. So they're not thinking that way. They're thinking about the physical temple that you're looking at. He says, destroy the temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. All right, verse 20. They replied, it has taken 46 years. Now listen to this. Let's go right over their head. They replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days? what they're talking about is Herod's temple. You know, Herod took the temple that they were worshiping in after they rebuilt it after getting out of Babylon, released from Babylon. And Herod started making it more magnificent than it had ever been. In fact, I think he started working on it. Once he started working on it, he never quit. And so that's what that reference to 46 years is. He was still adding on to it. Okay, so I believe that's what they're talking about, the renovation of Herod's temple, what we call Herod's temple, where the whole area was enlarged and the grandeur of the temple was enhanced. "46 years, you say. Tear it down, rebuild it in 3 days." Sure. It ends with a question and a giggle. That's what I've got in my notes here. Yeah, right. What a joke. For purity, 1,000 priests were trained as stone cutters. They cut 18. There was 18,000 men who worked full time until the project was completed. Some stones weighed 70 tons and can still be seen holding up the Temple Mount. If you look at the west wall, it's in Israel right now. It's ludicrous, they say. What a joke. You got to be kidding. Not as ludicrous on the surface as what it might seem. Religious leaders thought that the temple would be replaced. All right, here's the thing. We finished Ezekiel, and if you recall, the last six chapters dealt with what I call Ezekiel's temple, or the millennial temple. It's the temple that will be built and worshipped in during the 1,000-year reign of Christ after the tribulation, the Great Tribulation. The religious leaders thought that temple, the temple of Ezekiel 46, would be replaced. The temple they're in now would be replaced with the temple specified in Ezekiel 40 through 46. That's what they thought. Even later, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and it was really destroyed, they even tore the rocks down where there was nothing left standing and all the wood was burned. They thought Messiah would come with a new temple. Well, it is, but not when they think. But now, 3 days, you say. They do not understand, but how could they? They don't know about the crucifixion of Jesus. They're not even willing to accept that he is the Messiah. You remember John 1:1, it said he would be rejected by his own people? In John, the prologue to John, the first 18 verses, it talked about that. He would be rejected by his own people. And that's what we're going to see through the Gospel of John. The religious leaders couldn't stand him. All right, let's look at verse 21. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. So, John explains what Jesus meant with what he said. He referred to his body at the crucifixion and the resurrection. He saw his signs was part. All right. Verse 20. Did I read the right verse? No, I didn't. I read the wrong verse. Verse 21 said, but the temple he had spoken of was his body. All right, he's explaining to us. John was not talking to them. He's telling us what Jesus was talking about. He's telling in his narrative, in his narration of the life of Jesus, he's telling what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about his body. Because when John wrote this, he knew about the crucifixion and the resurrection. This was after all of that. This is a look back, an autobiography of sorts. A biography of sorts dictated for John to write. Okay, and then so in verse 22, it says this, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. They believed the words that Jesus had spoken about his resurrection, I might add. All right, verse 22, after the resurrection, they remembered this and understood then. The Bible says they believed. They did understand after the resurrection. We're going to see that when we get to it. I love the Gospel of John. I love it. Does this mean they did not believe what he said about that he would die and be resurrected? Does that mean they didn't believe that? It's hard to believe some things that you don't understand. And throughout the Gospel of John, they were being told they did not understand many things. We've already looked back at when Jesus was 12, his own mother, who had angels appear to her, telling her what was getting ready to happen and who this baby is, the Son of God. And still, at verse 12, she's being surprised. Why would you do such a thing to me, Jesus? Treat me this way. Why would you treat me this way? She did not understand, even when she heard what he was doing. Not until after his baptism, did she understand he is the Messiah. And that is true of everybody. We're going to see, looking back, they're saying, this kid was from Mary's son, he's from Nazareth, and that sort of thing. There will come a time when they're going to understand, but that time has not yet even come for the Jews. All right? It's still in their future from now. Okay, so it's hard to believe in something you don't understand, and they did not understand. For now, how can you believe something you don't understand? You have to do it on faith. You have to trust in it. All right? And there'll be more of that coming as we're doing our study here. Here without knowing, here without understanding, Jesus is predicting not only his death, but his resurrection, which they will remember and believe later. All right, verse 23 and 24. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He knew all people. They see other miraculous signs, so they see things that are not even recorded here. All right, that's what that's talking about. He was walking around Jerusalem doing things, and they were seeing all that stuff. They were miraculous signs not recorded in here. They saw these other miraculous signs as told by John, and they believed in his name. So there were some people that believed because they saw the sign. Not necessarily that he was the Messiah. We don't know, but they saw the signs and they believed. This is not the wholehearted faith of verse 11. This is more like, I see miraculous power, so I believe. I saw him do it, so I believe in his power. Do I believe he's the Messiah? Not so fast. I believe because I see. It doesn't take faith for that. I believe he's got the power to do that. It takes faith to believe in who he is. He did that because he is the Messiah. That's a tougher nut to crack, okay? And that is not what they had. Jesus said as much in verse 24. Let me read verse 24 again. It says, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. Jesus said as much in verse 24. They believed in him, but he would not believe in them. He would not believe that they were believing. Why? Because he knows all men. He knows when they believe as he requires and expects, and when they do not. He knew Nathanael. Remember, Nathanael was the last in chapter 1. Nathanael was the last disciple called in chapter 1. He knew who Nathanael was. This section ends the same way it did with Nathanael, with Jesus knowing. But what is he knowing? What he is knowing is not a practice, is not a positive, for some people. What Jesus knows about what they were saying about their belief is not a positive thought, because Jesus knows their heart, which we're going to look at right now, then we'll be done. Let me read verse 25. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. He knew each person's heart. I want to look at Jeremiah 17, then we're going to be through. Jeremiah 17, verses 9 and 10. You should remember this verse forever. It'll keep you straight. It'll keep you honest. All right. Jeremiah 17, verses 9 and 10. The heart is deceitful above all things. You can think you know your own heart, but your heart is deceitful. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. There's nothing you can do about it. That's the way your heart is. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Verse 10. I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward each person according to their conduct, according to what their deeds deserve. All right. Jesus does not quote this verse. John does not quote this verse, but this verse is very descriptive of what we're talking about. They thought they were believing, but they were believing in the act, not the man. Jesus knows their heart, and he knows that they were believing in the act, not the man. All right. All right, next week we're going to get into John chapter 3. If you want to know what it means to be born again, watch that video next week. Thank you for studying with me.